A roof in flames, a child's cry swallowed by smoke, and one man standing too late in the wrong place, carrying a guilt he would never outrun. Now, nearly 40 years later, that same man walks each morning beside a quiet river, a loyal dog at his side, a small town life that moves gently as if trying not to wake old ghosts. But memories rise when the world grows still. Wind sounds like fire. Darkness carries old voices. And guilt never truly leaves. On a morning that begins like any other, a simple piece of paper will pull that old soldier back toward a fire he thought was long behind him. And this time, the fire is calling him back for a reason. The morning light lay soft and pale over the small Midwestern town, a thin veil of gold on roofs, river, and roadside cottonwoods. In that light, Daniel Mercer moved the way men do who have learned to save their strength. Each step, measured, unhurried, and strangely precise. At 59, he was still broad through the shoulders, but time had pared him down. His frame was tall and a little leaner than it once had been, like a flagpole after the flag has been folded and put away. His hair, cut short out of old habit, was mostly gray now, with two bright streaks of silver at his temples that made his weathered face look gentler than he believed it was. Lines stitched themselves across his forehead and at the corners of his eyes, not in the pattern of easy laughter, but in the deeper pattern of squinting into dust, smoke, and distant trouble. He wore his usual uniform, the red and black buffalo-plaid shirt jacket that had become something of a local landmark, a cream-colored t-shirt peeking out at the collar, dark blue straight-leg jeans faded at the knees, and brown leather boots whose scuffed toes and worn heels spoke of years of walking more miles than he used to admit. On his left wrist, the military watch with a dark strap ticked quietly, the hands marching in circles, even though he no longer did. Beside him trotted Shadow, a German shepherd of about 7, with a heavy sable and tan coat and a broad, intelligent head. A faint white scar curved along the dog's left flank like a question mark, and another small nick marred the edge of one ear, the sort of marks that told their own stories without needing words. Shadow moved with the calm wariness of an animal that had seen too much, but decided to stay gentle anyway. His paws found the familiar path down toward the riverbank, claws clicking briefly on the cracked sidewalk before sinking into the soft dirt where the pavement ended. The river that morning was low and slow, a ribbon of brown-green water reflecting the sky in broken pieces. Daniel watched it the way some men watch a television screen, letting his eyes rest on something that asked nothing of him. He carried a paper cup of coffee in his right hand, the heat seeping into his fingers, and the leash hung loose in his left, more a courtesy than a necessity. Shadow rarely pulled. He knew the route, knew when to slow down for Daniel's knees, and when to stop for memories. "Heel," Daniel said quietly as a pickup rattled by on the distant road, more out of habit than need. His voice was low and slightly rough, like gravel under a boot. Shadow glanced up, amber eyes flicking to Daniel's face, then matched his pace exactly, the picture of disciplined companionship. To anyone watching from the porch of a nearby house, they would have looked like a pair that had walked together for years, which they had, though not as many years as Daniel sometimes wished. He had not had Shadow during the worst of it. Sometimes he wondered if that might have made a difference. The air held a faint chill, the kind that brushed the skin and then retreated, promising a warmer afternoon. Daniel inhaled deeply, letting the smell of damp soil, river water, and the faint trace of someone's distant bacon and eggs slide into his chest. For a moment, he tried to make that smell the only thing in his head. It did not work. It rarely did. Somewhere behind the calm lines of his face, an old scene played itself out with the stubbornness of a film reel that would not stop. Night instead of morning, heat instead of chill, the thick taste of smoke in his throat, and the screaming sound of metal and walls giving way. He remembered the weight of the rescue gear on his back, the radio buzzing against his ear with orders and numbers, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the dust like a blade of light. A house half collapsed, a family reported trapped inside. The way his boots had slid on shifting rubble as he and his team moved in. The brief flash of two small shoes in the beam of his light. He shook his head once, sharply, as if trying to clear water from his ears. Shadow, feeling the sudden tightness in the hand holding the leash, slowed and angled his body closer, brushing his fur against Daniel's leg in a quiet, insistent nudge. The dog's head tilted up, and he gave a small woof, not quite a bark, not quite a sigh. "I'm all right, boy," Daniel murmured, even though he knew that wasn't entirely true. His gaze drifted to the water again, but now the surface seemed to hold flickers of flame in its reflections, and the low rush of the river blurred for a second into the memory of sirens. He took another sip of coffee, though it had gone lukewarm, hoping the bitter taste would anchor him back in the present. It was easier, most days, to let the past go quiet. He had his routines for that. The early walk, the familiar clothes, the steady, unglamorous work of showing houses and filling out paperwork. Routines were like sandbags around a levee. They did not stop the river, but they could keep it from taking everything. Shadow tugged gently toward the water's edge, nose working the air. The dog paused by a cluster of river stones and sniffed at them with careful concentration, tail making a slow, thoughtful sweep. Daniel let him, watching the way the dog's body moved, the muscles under the coat shifting like well-made machinery. Whoever had owned Shadow before, whether a police department, a military unit, or just someone who took training seriously, had done the work well. Even in something as simple as a morning walk, there was a quiet precision to the dog's choices. "Find anything interesting?" Daniel asked, the corner of his mouth twitching. It was not quite a smile, but it was the closest he came most mornings. Shadow lifted his head with a leaf stuck comically to his nose, and for a second, the solemn germanShepherd looked almost puppyish. Daniel huffed out a short, surprised breath that could nearly be mistaken for a chuckle. There were moments, small and quickly passing, when the world still knew how to be gentle with him. He folded them away like keepsakes in a pocket. By the time the sun had cleared the rooftops and begun to warm the back of his jacket, Daniel was back at his modest one-story house near the edge of town. The place was clean, but clearly lived in by one person and one dog. A faded couch, a coffee table with rings from old mugs, a row of real estate brochures lined up too neatly on the sideboard, and a dog bed in the corner that Shadow used about half the time, preferring, more often than not, the floor near the front door. Daniel hung his jacket on the peg by the door, revealing the cream t-shirt stretched across a chest that had once been thicker with muscle. The jeans sat comfortably at his hips, worn in rather than worn out, the denim soft with years of bending and lifting. He toed off his boots, the brown leather creasing as if sighing with relief, and placed them carefully beside the door. Old training again, gear in its proper place. The kitchen smelled faintly of last night's coffee and toast, the sort of lonely bachelor scent that spoke of someone who had learned to live with good enough rather than festive. On the fridge, a single photograph hung crooked under a magnet shaped like a house. Daniel in uniform, much younger, standing in front of a helicopter with 3 other men. One of them had an arm hooked casually around Daniel's neck, both of them grinning in the reckless, lopsided way of people who think tomorrow is assured. Daniel barely glanced at it as he moved to his small desk near the window, where morning light made squares on the worn wood. The desk held a laptop, a stack of property listings bound with a rubber band, and a ceramic mug full of pens. Shadow settled at his feet, lying down with a grunt, front paws stretched out, head between them, ears still tilted toward the sounds of the street outside. Daniel woke the laptop, the screen's glow washing over his lined face. His email inbox was a quiet affair at that hour. A newsletter from the hardware store, a note from a past client asking about property taxes, a spam message promising miracle joint relief that he snorted at without opening. Then he saw the subject line that would pull the morning into a different shape. New listing, Ellison Farm, priority. The sender was a familiar corporate address, listings@reevescoaldev.com. Reeves and Coal Development had been sniffing around the region for years, buying pockets of cheap land and dressing them up into subdivisions with cul-de-sacs and cheerful names like Maple Ridge and Sunny Creek. Daniel had sold a few of those houses. He did not particularly love them, but people needed places to live, and roofs were roofs. He clicked the email open. The message was crisp and impersonal, the way corporate correspondence often was. Dear Mr. Mercer, attached please. Find the file for the Ellison Farm property on County Road 7. As discussed, our firm is seeking a quick sale and would appreciate your prompt attention to this listing. We believe your local knowledge makes you uniquely suited to represent this property. Please review the attached documents and confirm receipt at your earliest convenience. Sincerely, Reeves and Coal Development. There was a digital signature, but no human name attached to it. That bothered him more than he liked to admit. Daniel downloaded the attachment and watched the progress bar creep along. Shadow's ears flicked at the faint click of the mouse, then settled again. When the file opened, the first thing that caught Daniel's eye was the acreage, 50 acres, give or take, of mixed pasture and woodland, an old farmhouse, and 2 outbuildings. The second thing was the price. So low, he almost assumed there had been a typo. He leaned back in his chair, the wood creaking softly under his weight, and rubbed his forehead with 2 fingers. 50 acres at that price did not make sense, not even with a rundown house. Land was patient. It held its value better than most things. You had to hurt it pretty badly to make it that cheap. He scrolled through the pages slowly. There was a brief description. former family agricultural property, currently vacant, and a few grainy photos that looked like they had been taken in a hurry on a cloudy day. The farmhouse sagged a little in the middle, but he had seen worse. The barn leaned, but barns always leaned. At the bottom of the first page, a short line in small font noted, "Seller prefers expedited sale. Property sold as is." As is, he muttered. Always the sweetest poison. He checked the tax records included in the file. The name on the last few years' bills was a corporate shell he knew belonged to Reeves and Cole. But before that, 3 decades of payments had been made by someone named Ellison. Daniel let the name sit in his mind for a moment. It stirred a faint echo. Had he heard it in a news story? In a casual conversation at the diner? He could not quite place it. The watch on his wrist ticked calmly, but something in his chest felt a half step out of rhythm. Shadow gave a low, questioning chuff, as if sensing that some invisible line had just been crossed. Daniel's fingers tightened slightly on the mouse. He did not see anything in the documents that explicitly shouted trouble. No red-stamped warnings, no notes about contamination or liens. But the overall picture felt wrong in the small, hard way that a pebble inside a boot feels is wrong. You can ignore it for a while, but it will not stop being there. His training, both as a rescuer and as a man who had spent years walking through broken places, had taught him to listen to that feeling. It had saved lives more than once. It had also, once, not been enough. "What do you think, Shadow?" he asked softly, glancing down. The dog had rolled onto one hip, but his eyes were open, fixed on Daniel's face with an intensity that would have unnerved anyone who was not used to being studied by a working dog. Shadow's ears pricked forward, and he gave a single, decisive bark, more statement than noise. "Yeah," Daniel said. "Me too." He could already imagine the follow-up call from Reeves and Cole when he did not respond quickly. The cheerful but insistent voice on the other end, pressing for a quick listing, throwing around phrases like "great opportunity" and "win-win." They would not want questions. They would want signatures. It was not the first time a seller had been in a hurry, and sometimes the reasons were perfectly ordinary. Divorce, debt, a job in another state. But a big corporate outfit holding a farm they clearly wanted off their books, at a price that low, that was not ordinary. Not in his town, not on his watch. He sighed and leaned back again, the chair protesting softly. The safe thing, the easy thing, would be to take the listing, show the place enough to say he had done his job, and let someone else's name eventually settle into the tax records where Ellison's had been. After all, he reminded himself, he was just a real estate agent now. He sold houses. He didn't run investigations. He was nearly 60. He woke up in the middle of the night sometimes with his heart pounding from dreams of collapsing roofs and unreachable voices. He was tired of being the one who ran toward trouble. Shadow shifted, pressing his head lightly against Daniel's knee, the warmth of the dog's skull steady and present through the denim. Daniel's hand found the familiar fur without thinking, fingers curling just behind one ear in a slow, grounding motion. He looked back at the listing on the screen, at the sagging farmhouse, and the too low price printed in neat black digits, and felt something old and stubborn in his chest straighten its spine. "All right," he said quietly, to himself, as much as to the dog and the empty room. "We'll at least go and look." His cursor drifted to the reply button, hesitated there as the morning light shifted across the desk. And in that small pause, he realized that somewhere deep down, both he and Shadow already knew this was not going to be just another piece of land. The gravel road to the Ellison farm ran straight as a ruled line beneath a high, colorless sky, dust lifting in thin ghosts behind Daniel's pickup as he drove. The town fell away quickly, replaced by fields half awake from winter, flat stretches of stubble, and stubborn patches of snow clinging to the shaded sides of hedgerows. Daniel kept one hand light on the steering wheel, the other resting near the gear shift, his shoulders slightly hunched, the way they always were when he was heading toward something he didn't quite understand. Beside him on the passenger seat, Shadow sat upright. The big German Shepherd braced easily against the bumps, his front paws planted, ears pointed forward like twin radar dishes. The dog's gaze stayed fixed on the landscape ahead, as if he, too, had read the listing and didn't like the price. They had driven this county road before, past mailboxes with peeling numbers and fences repaired more with hope than with money. But today felt different. Maybe it was the way the wind seemed to die as they turned off the main road, or how the telephone wires above them sagged in a deeper arc, as if tired. Maybe it was just the knowledge sitting in Daniel's gut that 50 acres this cheap always had a story, and stories weren't often kind. The entrance to the farm announced itself less by design than by neglect. A gap in a rusted wire fence, two leaning posts that might once have held a gate, and a battered wooden sign face down in the weeds. Daniel slowed the truck and turned in, tires crunching over gravel, buried under years of dirt and tufts of wild grass. The path ahead was more suggestion than road, a pair of tire ruts now overgrown with brittle stems that scraped along the underside of the truck like fingernails against tin. He felt the steering wheel jerk slightly as the tires found and lost the ruts. He let the truck creep forward, eyes scanning the grounds out of old habit, points of cover, sight lines, exits, though he told himself this was just another property visit. Shadow shifted closer to the windshield, placing his front paws on the edge of the seat to peer out more intently. The dog's hackles rose, the fur along his spine lifting in a subtle but unmistakable ridge. A low growl vibrated in Shadow's chest, not loud enough to fill the cab, but impossible to ignore. "Easy," Daniel said quietly, not to dismiss the warning, but to steady it. "We're just taking a look." Still, his own grip tightened, and he found he was holding his breath without meaning to. The farmhouse came into view as they rounded a stand of leafless trees. It sat hunched in the middle distance, 2 stories of tired wood slumping gently toward the earth. Paint had once been white, he imagined, but now the boards were a patchwork of gray, beige, and exposed timber. Several windows were broken or boarded over, and part of the front porch roof had caved in, leaving splintered beams reaching out at odd angles, like a hand caught mid-collapse. Even from inside the truck, Daniel could feel the particular quiet that wrapped the place. It wasn't the simple absence of sound, it was the feeling that whatever sound had once lived here, voices, radios, the clatter of dishes, had been abruptly cut off and never fully replaced by wind and birds. He rolled the truck to a stop a little way from the house and killed the engine. The sudden silence pressed in. Shadow's nose went to work immediately, snuffling the air vents, his breath quick and shallow. Daniel opened his door, the hinges complaining in a familiar squeak. and the smell of old wood, damp earth, and something faintly metallic flowed in to meet him. He stepped down, boots sinking slightly into the soft ground, and the chill in the air made itself more present without the windshield between him and it. He rounded the truck to open the passenger side. Shadow leaped down with practiced ease, landing light on his paws despite his size. The dog's tail hung low, not tucked but cautious, swinging in a slow, controlled arc as he surveyed the yard. His ears turned this way and that, cataloging every distant creak and rustle. The wind moved through the dried weeds with a whispering hiss, but even that seemed subdued. Daniel closed the truck door gently and stood for a moment, letting his eyes adjust to the scale of the place. 50 acres didn't look like much when you were standing in the middle of it, but you could feel the weight of it all the same. The house. The barn further back, its roof sagging but still holding. A line of skeletal trees tracing what had probably been a driveway or a property boundary once upon a time. He could almost see the ghost of a tire swing hanging from one of the branches. Children's laughter layered under the quiet like a sound trapped in amber. "Well," he murmured, more to the dog than anything, "here we are." Shadow moved toward the farmhouse, nose close to the ground, inhaling deeply, the fur along his shoulders bristling a little more with each step. He stopped near the bottom of the crooked front steps and sniffed the air in short bursts, head angled as if listening to something Daniel couldn't hear. The dog gave a short, uneasy bark toward the dark rectangle of the open front door, then backed up half a step, as though whatever scent drifted out from inside did not belong to the present. "You smell the past, huh?" Daniel said under his breath. He knew better than most that some places held onto their memories like stains. He told himself he would check the inside later, after an outside walk around, after he had made himself a little more used to being here. Real estate work had taught him that first impressions could lie. Sometimes the ugliest house hid the best bones, and sometimes a fresh coat of paint tried to cover rot. Right now, though, the first impression felt closer to truth than he liked. A movement at the edge of his vision pulled his gaze away from the house. Off to the right, half shielded by a cluster of scrubby bushes and a pair of old cottonwoods, sat a trailer he hadn't noticed immediately. It was a faded white single wide with streaks of rust running down from the window frames, the kind of place that had probably been new and hopeful 30 years ago, and had been losing that battle ever since. The front steps were a makeshift arrangement of concrete blocks and two cinder-stained planks. A TV antenna leaned precariously from the roof, and a thin curl of smoke rose from a bent metal pipe that served as a stovepipe, a quiet sign of present life. As he watched, the trailer door opened with a soft, metallic clank. A woman stepped out, pausing on the top concrete block as if to steady herself between the inside world and the outside one. She looked to be in her early 60s, maybe a little older. The kind of age where it was hard to tell what belonged to time and what belonged to worry. She was short and sturdy, with shoulders that had learned to carry loads without complaint, and she wore a faded flannel shirt over a plain t-shirt, jeans gone thin at the knees, and rubber boots dusted with mud. Her face was lined, not delicately, but in deep, practical strokes, as if life had carved its marks with a working knife rather than a fine brush. Her hair, once dark, was now mostly silver, pulled back into a low, hurried ponytail. What struck Daniel most wasn't the lines or the gray, but the way her eyes, pale blue, sharp and tired all at once, took in his truck, his clothes, and his dog in a single sweep. There was no panic there, only a guarded assessment, the look of someone who had been surprised enough times to stop being surprised. A boy followed her out, hovering in the doorway for a moment before stepping down onto the blocks. He looked to be about 10, all elbows and knees under an oversized hoodie, with jeans a little too short at the ankle and sneakers that had known better days. His hair was a light brown mop that refused to be tamed, falling into his eyes even as he tried to shake it away. The boy's face was thin, with the beginnings of angles that would one day make him handsome if life let him keep them. But right now, they mostly made his big, wary eyes look bigger. Those eyes flicked from Daniel to the truck to the farmhouse, then back again, like he was trying to keep track of too many possible dangers at once. Cradled carefully in his arms was a cat, a long-bodied, bony old thing with fur the color of ash and cream. The cat's ears were nicked, its tail thin and a little ragged, but it lay calm in the boy's hold, paws tucked in, golden eyes half closed in a posture of resigned royalty. Daniel had seen that posture on old soldiers too. The woman made the first move, stepping down the blocks and onto the bare earth. She walked toward Daniel with a deliberate, measured pace, neither rushing nor hanging back. The boy and the cat trailing half a step behind the shadows. Ears shot forward again, and he lifted his head, body tensing as they approached. A soft rumble started low in his chest, not hostile, more like a warning that he was paying attention. "Shadow," Daniel said quietly. The dog's muscles eased a fraction, but he stayed alert, tail held level. "Morning," Daniel called, lifting a hand in a small, non-threatening wave as the distance closed. His voice was gentle, but carried easily. "Name's Daniel Mercer. I'm a local agent. I got an email about this property from Reeves and Cole." The woman stopped a few paces away, leaving enough space that no one would feel crowded. Up close, the fine details of her face sharpened. The faint dark crescents under her eyes, the deep lines running from the sides of her nose to the corners of her mouth, the small scar near her left eyebrow, pale against the weathered skin. She had the look of someone who'd done a lot of listening and not been believed enough. "I know who you are," she said. Her voice was low and a little rough, but steady, with the flat vowels of someone who had lived in this county all her life. "You sold the Thompsons that house on Maple. My sister's girl cleans for them sometimes." There was no accusation in her tone, just a simple statement of fact. Still, Daniel felt oddly as if he were being weighed. "Then you've got the advantage on me," he replied, offering a small, respectful tilt of his head. "I don't believe we've met." She hesitated half a heartbeat, then nodded once, like she'd made a decision. "Martha Ellison," she said, "this is my grandson, Lucas." The boy ducked his head slightly at the sound of his name, his arms tightening around the cat. "And this here's Daisy. She thinks she owns the place." The attempt at humor was faint, but it was there, a dry, brittle thread that made Lucas's mouth twitch as if he wanted to smile and had forgotten how. Daniel looked at the cat, who blinked at him slowly, and then at the boy. "Nice to meet you, Martha. Lucas, Daisy," he said. "You've got a good grip there, son. She looks like she'd bolt if she got the chance. Lucas shrugged one shoulder, eyes flicking nervously to Shadow. She's old, the boy muttered. Doesn't like new people much. His voice was soft and high, still boyish, but there was a stiffness in it that didn't belong to 10-year-olds. Can't say I blame her, Martha said. Her gaze slid past Daniel to the farmhouse and then back to him. Reeves and Cole send you to tell me what a fine development opportunity this is. The way she wrapped her tongue around the corporate phrase made it sound ridiculous, almost dirty. Daniel felt the weight of her eyes and chose his next words carefully. They sent me the file, he said. Asked me to take a look. Said they wanted a quick sale. Quick sale? Martha repeated. That's one way to say, get rid of the evidence before anyone asks. Too many questions. There was no drama in her voice, no attempt to shock him. Just another stone added to a pile that had been growing for a while. Something in his chest tightened. What kind of questions? He asked. Martha's eyes narrowed the smallest bit, studying him, not like a client evaluating an agent, but like a woman deciding whether a stranger could be trusted with anything that mattered. You ever wonder, she said slowly, how a farm that fed 3 generations ends up in the hands of some outfit with an office 3 states away? She didn't wait for him to answer. My husband died here, Mr. Mercer, in that barn. She jerked her chin toward the sagging structure. They called it an industrial accident. Wrote it up real neat. Machines fail, men die. Nobody's fault. Everybody goes home. Lucas shifted his weight, pressing his face into the cat's fur for a moment. The animal endured it with the patience of the very old. I'm sorry, Daniel said quietly, and he meant it. The words felt small, but they were all he had in that instant. He'd stood in front of too many people and not had better ones. They were doing some side work, Martha went on, staring past him now, as if the memory were a movie projected on the blank facade of the farmhouse. Helping some folks from Reeves and Cole run tests. Look at the soil. They said it was just to see if it was worth drilling a well deeper, maybe putting in some irrigation. Next thing I know, my Henry's on a stretcher, and I'm being told there was an explosion, a malfunction. Her mouth twisted around the word. The sheriff told me it was just bad luck. Daniel listened, the sound of her story knitting itself onto the quiet. He could picture it too easily. The rush, the smoke, the official words. Shadow stepped a little closer to Lucas, drawn perhaps by the boy's trembling. The dog lowered his head, sniffing the air near the boy's sleeve. Then, with great care, pressed the side of his muzzle against the child's arm in a slow, deliberate nudge. Lucas froze, eyes widening, and then, bit by bit, his rigid posture softened. One of his hands rose from the cat's back to rest tentatively on Shadow's head. The germanShepherd stood absolutely still, tail giving a slow, reassuring swish. After Henry died, Martha continued, her voice thinning, those Reeves and Cole men were at my door within a month. Papers in hand, smiles on their faces, said they'd help me out by taking the farm, clearing the debts, leaving me a little corner so I wouldn't have to worry myself over all that land. She snorted softly, the sound bitter. Help. That's what they called it. Daniel glanced toward the house again, then back to her. And did you sign? Martha finished for him. I signed away more than I understood. I kept this strip, enough for the trailer and a bit of garden. Figured that was all I could manage. Me and a boy to raise. She looked at Lucas with a mixture of fierceness and exhaustion. But they didn't stop there. They've been leaning on me ever since. Letters, calls, offers that aren't really offers. Telling me nobody'll want to buy a place that still has a widow hanging on like a bad memory. Daniel felt his jaw tighten. He imagined the calls, the letters, the veiled suggestions. So when I got that email, he began. When you got that email, Martha said, they were hoping you'd be the last piece. Local face, friendly voice, someone I might trust enough to open the door to the bulldozers. Her pale eyes fixed on him then, pinning him in place as effectively as nails. Is that what you are, Mr. Mercer? Another friendly voice? He swallowed, the question landing heavier than he'd anticipated. He was used to being liked, or at least tolerated. He sold houses, not lies. But here, in the shadow of the sagging farmhouse and under the weight of Martha Ellison's gaze, his work felt suddenly less neutral. A crow called raucously from a tree somewhere behind the barn, the harsh sound cutting briefly through the silence and then fading. The wind kicked up a little, stirring the dry grass around their feet, carrying the faint smell of smoke from the trailer's stove. Lucas's fingers had sunk deeper into Shadow's fur now, the boy leaning into the dog as if he were some kind of living fence post holding him upright. Shadow accepted the weight without complaint, eyes half closed, his body a steady, wordless anchor. Martha took a small step closer, enough that Daniel could see the sheen in her eyes that hadn't been there before. I'm tired, Mr. Mercer, she said softly. Tired of men in suits telling me what's best for me. Tired of papers I don't fully understand. Tired of feeling like I'm in the way on the land my husband died working. So, I'll ask you straight. Her voice steadied, gathering around the words like a rope pulled taut. Are you here to help me? Or are you just here to sell this place to somebody else and walk away? She hesitated, then added, even quieter, will you help me? Or will you sell this place to someone else and turn your back? The question hung between them in the cold, still air. And Daniel felt every second stretch as he realized he did not yet know how to answer it. The next morning, the sky over town was a flat, washed-out gray, the kind of color that made the brick of the courthouse look older and more tired than usual as Daniel climbed the worn limestone steps. He'd changed from his boots to a pair of plain work shoes out of habit, but the rest of him looked much the same as he always did. The plaid jacket, the straight-backed posture that never quite left, and the quiet set of a man who'd spent years moving with purpose through other people's emergencies. The courthouse smelled faintly of floor polish and old paper, a scent that settled into his lungs like dust. Shadows pooled in the corners of the hallway despite the overhead fluorescence, and the echo of his footsteps seemed louder than it had any right to be at that hour. Shadow padded at his side, allowed inside only because the clerk at the front desk had long ago decided that a calm German shepherd on a leash was less trouble than arguing with a veteran about service animals. The dog's nails ticked softly on the linoleum, his ears swiveling at distant doors opening and closing. Phones ringing, voices muttering behind frosted glass. Daniel made his way to the records room, a windowless space that had once been a storage closet and still carried that personality. Low ceiling, metal shelves lined with box files and binders, a single humming light overhead. Behind the counter sat a woman in her late 50s, maybe early 60s, with short salt and pepper hair and glasses on a chain. Her nameplate read R. Hollis. Rita Hollis had the look of someone who knew where everything was and how long it had been there, with a face more practical than pretty, cheeks softening but eyes sharp behind the lenses. She wore a cardigan with pearl buttons and had a pencil stuck in her hair, like a forgotten ornament. When Daniel stepped in, she glanced up and gave him a nod that was almost warm. "Morning, Mercer," she said. "You're in early. Tax season'll do that to a man." Her voice had a dry rasp and a hint of amusement. "Morning, Rita," Daniel replied, setting a hand lightly on the counter. "I'm not here for taxes, for once. Got a property I need to look at, and I'd like to see what the county's got on file." Her gaze flicked down to Shadow, who sat neatly beside him, then back up. "He behave in archives?" she asked. "Better than most people," Daniel said. That won him a small huff of a smile. "Ain't that the truth? All right, what are we digging into?" He gave her the parcel number and the name, Ellison Farm, and watched as she wrote it down in neat block letters, then rose from her chair with a small sigh. "Let me see what the dinosaurs have to say," she muttered, disappearing into the maze of shelves. Daniel stood waiting, listening to the rustle and thump of file boxes being shifted. Shadow leaned against his leg and sniffed the air as if cataloging the ghosts of 1,000 old arguments and agreements, stored here in ink and signatures. It didn't take much to imagine the lives that had passed across this counter. The farms divided, the houses foreclosed, the marriages dissolved. Land, he thought, held stories long after people thought they had told the last one. "Got the main file," Rita called, emerging with a beige folder and a thinner manila one. She set them on the counter with a soft slap. "This here's tax history and ownership. This little one's incident reports linked to the address. You wanting to sit?" "If you don't mind. Long as you don't steal my pen," she said, sliding a ballpoint toward him anyway. Her tone was light, but he saw the curiosity in the way she watched him. He took the files to a small table, Shadow flopping down at his feet, chin on paws, eyes open and alert. Daniel opened the larger folder first. Years of payments, neat columns of numbers, the Ellison name marching across decades, then an abrupt shift to a corporate entity less than 2 years old. He traced the boundary map with his eyes, familiar lines from the listing. But here, printed in an earlier hand, something snagged his attention. Along one border, a faint erase mark, the paper smudged as if something had been rubbed out and redrawn. The new line shaved off a sliver of land that might not mean much to anyone looking from a distance, but to someone used to reading the lay of the land, it was the kind of change that had reasons. He picked up the provided pen and circled the area lightly, making a small note in his own shorthand. Old training surfaced as he worked, the way he'd been taught to scan for anomalies, to look for mismatched details in a situation report, to notice not just what was present, but what was conspicuously absent. He shifted to the thinner manila folder. Inside were only a few sheets, a single-page incident report from the sheriff's office, a photocopy of a death certificate, and a brief notice about an OSHA inquiry that seemed to have evaporated after one form. The sheriff's report was what made his jaw tighten. On date, Henry Ellison, male, age 61, was found deceased on family property. Apparent cause, industrial accident with machinery. No signs of foul play observed. Case closed. That was nearly the full body of the text, surrounded by more space than ink. No diagram of the scene, no statements from witnesses beyond a clipped line noting company representatives present. He'd written after-action reports more detailed than this about a sprained ankle. He flipped the page over. The back was blank. "You kidding me?" he murmured under his breath. Shadow's ears pricked at the tone. "Problem?" Rita asked from the counter, clearly unable to help listening in. "Just seems thin," Daniel said. He held up the page. "You got any more on this incident? Photos? Supplemental reports?" She came over, adjusted her glasses, and peered at the document. Up close, he could see the fine wrinkles at the corners of her mouth, lines carved by years of tight-lipped disapproval at messy paperwork. "That's what's in the system," she said slowly. "Accident on farm, man killed, sheriff clears it. Sometimes that's all there is." "Sometimes," he agreed, "but not often. Not these days." He tapped the reference number for the OSHA note. "What about this inquiry?" Rita pursed her lips and went back to her computer terminal, fingers clicking over the keyboard. He watched the reflected light from the screen flash in her glasses. After a moment, she made a small sound of annoyance. "Well, that's just dumb," she said. "They got it logged here, but the attachments are unavailable. Might mean they're in another box. Might mean somebody misfiled them in with something else entirely." She glanced at him. "Might mean someone walked off with them years ago, too, though we're not supposed to say that out loud." There was no conspiracy in her voice, just the resignation of someone who'd watched human nature long enough. "Mind if I check the physical boxes?" he asked. "Be my guest. Just don't rearrange my labels." She gestured to a row of shelves. "OSHA stuff's that section there. You know how to read numbers." He did. He spent the next 20 minutes pulling down boxes, sliding folders aside, looking for anything with the Ellison address. The motion soothed some old part of him. Search patterns, systematic coverage, the quiet reward of finding what others had overlooked. Today, though, the reward didn't come. There were forms about a grain silo in the next county, a chemical spill at a factory 3 towns over, a fall from scaffolding on a downtown building. Nothing with Ellison's name. He replaced the last box carefully and stood, feeling the stiffness in his knees complain. "No luck?" Rita asked. He shook his head. "If you're hiding anything back there, you're doing a good job." She snorted. "Honey, I hide my chocolate, not federal paperwork. Look, if it's not where it's supposed to be, chances are it never made it here, or someone decided it didn't need to be kept. People get creative when they're trying to keep a town's record clean." She put a little ironic curl around that last word. He thanked her, signed the log to note that he'd viewed the files, and tucked the small notes he'd made into his jacket pocket. As he left, Shadow rose smoothly and fell into step beside him, the dog's head turning once toward the shelves, as if committing the room's smells to memory. Outside, the gray sky had deepened, clouds thickening into something that might turn to rain, or might just hang there, undecided. Daniel paused on the courthouse steps and looked out over Main Street. Cars rolled by. A delivery truck idled near the diner. Someone laughed on the sidewalk. It all looked normal, as it always did. But in his pocket was a map with a smudged boundary and a death written up like a minor inconvenience. In his mind, Martha's voice threaded through it. They called it an industrial accident. They said it was just bad luck. He had seen bad luck. This didn't smell like it. By late afternoon, he was back on the road, to the Ellison farm, the dust rising around the truck's tires in small, restless clouds. Shadow sat in his usual place, calmer this time, but not relaxed. The way a sentry might be in territory, he's already marked as suspicious. The sun was low behind the clouds, throwing a dull, diffuse light over the fields as he turned in through the same broken gap in the fence. The farmhouse looked no less tired in this light, but it looked more like a challenge. He parked closer than before, killed the engine, and let the quiet settle. Martha's trailer was still there, smoke from the stovepipe curling lazily. He didn't see her or Lucas outside, and he decided not to bother them yet. This visit was to the house, to the bones of the story. "Stay close," he told Shadow as they crossed the yard. The dog trotted alongside him, tail level, nose working. At the front steps, Daniel tested the wood with his boot, feeling for softness. It creaked, but held. The open doorway was a mouth of shadow, the interior thick with the smell of old ash, mouse droppings, and something more chemical underneath. Faint but there, like a memory. He clicked on a small flashlight from his pocket, a habit he never quite broke, and stepped in meeting. The temperature seemed to drop 2 degrees as he crossed the threshold. Light from the doorway reached only a short distance, giving way to dimness where his beam had to do the work. The walls of the front room were paneled in aged wood, once varnished, now dulled. Along one wall, near what might have been a sitting area, dark streaks licked upward toward the ceiling, fanned out in crooked tongues. Old scorch marks, the edges feathered, spoke of fire that had flared and then died, or been put out, before it could take the whole structure. Daniel lifted his light, tracing the pattern. He'd seen burns like that before, not from a simple kitchen grease fire, but from something more explosive, a flash that had nowhere to go. Across the ceiling and down another wall ran a spider web of hairline cracks, converging near a spot where the plaster bulged slightly, as if the house had taken a blow and never quite healed. He stepped carefully, feeling the boards give a little under his weight. Shadow's paws were almost silent on the dusty floor, but the dog's breathing had changed, a little faster, a hint of tension. The German Shepherd sniffed at the scorched wall, snorted, then backed away, eyes flicking around the room as if mapping invisible currents. "Take it easy," Daniel murmured, more out of habit than an expectation that the dog would suddenly relax in a place like this. In truth, the hair on his own arms felt as if it wanted to stand up. He moved slowly through the room, shining the flashlight over an overturned chair, a broken lamp, the remains of a rug burned in an odd, uneven pattern. There was no sign anyone had tried to salvage much. The fire had done its damage, and then time had come in behind it, adding dust and cobwebs and the faded look of abandonment. Shadow gave a short, sharp bark from the far corner. Daniel turned, the beam jerking to find the dog standing with one paw braced against the floor, nails scraping at a particular spot where 2 boards met. The shepherd scratched again, then looked back at Daniel, then down, then back up, clear as speech to a man who'd spent enough hours reading canine body language. "All right," Daniel said, crouching as he approached. "What have you got?" Up close, he could see that the boards there were a fraction more warped than the others, the edges darker, as if moisture, or something else, had seeped through at some point. There was a faint, irregular seam, not quite aligned with the rest, where someone had once pried this section up and then laid it back down without much care. He set the flashlight on the floor so the beam washed across the boards and leaned his weight on one side. With his other hand, he pried gently at the seam. The wood resisted, then gave with a reluctant creak. Dust puffed up, making him cough once, the taste dry and old. Together, man and dog worked the board free, Daniel levering it up, Shadow stepping back just enough to give him room, then leaning in again to sniff the dark space revealed beneath. The smell that rose was stronger, char, metal, and a sour tang that reminded Daniel of burned insulation and oil. He aimed the flashlight down into the gap. There, resting on a joist as if someone had dropped it in haste and then hidden the evidence in even greater haste, lay a hard hat. What color it had once been was difficult to say. Now the plastic was a mottled gray-black, melted and warped along one side. The chin strap had fused in places, and the brim curled like paper held to a flame too long. Beside it, half covered by ash and splinters, were several small, twisted pieces of metal. He reached in carefully and lifted the hard hat out. It was lighter than he expected, but the damage was unmistakable. As he turned it in his hands, flakes of blackened material crumbled onto the floor. Inside, just visible under the residue, was a faded sticker from a safety manufacturer, the kind often used in construction sites and industrial operations. He set the hat gently aside and picked up one of the metal fragments. It was jagged, the edges sharp, but the shape suggested it had once been part of something cylindrical. There were faint grooves along one side, the kind that came from being screwed into place. He'd seen pieces like this before, blown apart from pressure valves, piping, fittings not made to handle the strain they'd been put under. They weren't just drilling a well, he said softly to himself, to Shadow, to the empty room. They were running a test. Shadow whined low, circling once, then sitting close enough that his shoulder pressed against Daniel's knee. The contact steadied him, but it didn't calm the thoughts assembling in his mind. Altered property lines, missing safety reports, a widow's story of men from a development company bringing in equipment. None of it was proof, not yet, but it was more than rumor. It was something you could hold in your hand and feel the weight of. That was when he heard it, the distant crunch of tires on gravel, the sound reaching them muffled through the walls at first, then clearer as engines throttled back. Daniel straightened, instinct snapping him upright. Shadow was already on his feet, head up, ears pointed toward the front of the house. Another second, and the doors of vehicles slammed in succession, 1, 2, maybe more. Voices, low, indistinct, drifted through the cracked window. Daniel's grip tightened around the metal fragment before he forced himself to set it down beside the hard hat, nudging the floorboard partially back over the gap without fully sealing it. He crossed to a window and eased a slat of the warped blind aside just enough to see. 2 pickup trucks had pulled up near the gate, both dark-colored, both caked in enough dust to obscure any logos. 3 men stood by the nearest, another by the second truck. They were built the way heavy work builds you. Thick arms, thick necks, bellies not entirely fat, but not entirely muscle either. Ball caps, denim jackets, work boots. One of them, a man in his mid-40s with a square jaw shadowed by stubble and a nose that had been broken at least once, looked up toward the house with narrowed eyes. Even from this distance, his expression held that particular blend of boredom and menace Daniel had seen in men who'd done too many small bad things and never been called on them. The man said something to the others, then started up the path toward the front steps, his gait unhurried, confident, like someone arriving at a place he considered already his. Shadow rumbled deep in his throat, and Daniel laid a hand on the dog's shoulder, grounding them both. He stepped back from the window and moved toward the doorway, meeting the man before he could knock or kick the door in. The front room seemed colder now, as if the chill from outside had seeped in ahead of the visitors. The first man reached the threshold and stopped, one hand resting against the splintered door frame. Up close, Daniel could see the lines around his eyes, the slight redness to the whites that spoke of late nights and cheap liquor, the faint sheen of sweat despite the cool day. His gaze flicked briefly to Shadow, assessed the dog, then returned to Daniel. "Mr. Mercer," he drawled, pronouncing the name with an ease that said he'd practiced it. "Heard you might be out here having yourself a look around." His voice was casual, but the set of it, his mouth wasn't. "That's right," Daniel said evenly. "You with Reeves and Cole?" The man's lips twitched in something that wasn't quite a smile. "You could say that. They like to have local help keeping an eye on things." He glanced past Daniel into the dim interior of the house, as if trying to see what might have been disturbed. "Place isn't exactly safe, you know. Lot of ways a man could get hurt rooting around in old bones." Behind him, the other men lingered near the trucks, leaning against the fenders, arms crossed, the sort of posture meant to say they weren't involved unless they needed to be. Their presence was as loud as any shouted threat. Daniel felt his heartbeat pick up, but his face remained calm. "I've seen worse," he said. "Seemed worth a walk through. Due diligence." The man clicked his tongue softly. Due diligence. He tested the phrase like it was a foreign word. Then he leaned in just a fraction, enough that Daniel could smell cigarettes and coffee on his breath. "Thing is, some folks in town get nervous when people start asking too many questions about what happened out here. They figure the past is the past." His eyes hardened, the easy facade slipping. "And they figure, Mr. Mercer, that it might be in your best interest not to go digging too deep into things that don't concern you." He let the words hang for a heartbeat, then added, with a smile that never reached his eyes, "Best thing you could do is take your commission when it comes. Find a nice little house in town to sell to some young couple and leave these 50 acres to the people who know how to handle them." Shadow stepped forward half a step, placing himself slightly between Daniel and the stranger, muscles bunched under his coat, teeth just barely visible behind parted lips. The man's gaze flicked to the dog again, and this time Daniel saw a flicker of respect. Then those hard eyes came back to him. "You understand me, Mr. Mercer?" he asked softly. "You'd be smart not to dig up old stories that are better off staying buried." Standing there in the doorway of the cold, scarred house, with the melted hard hat and twisted metal still warm in his memory, and the weight of Martha's question heavier than ever in his chest, Daniel realized that whatever choice he made next would decide whether he stayed a man who just sold properties or became something else entirely. The night settled over Daniel's small kitchen like a weight. heavier than the darkness pressed against the window panes. The house was quiet, except for the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional tick of cooling pipes. But inside his chest, everything felt too loud. Daniel sat at the scarred wooden table with a mug of untouched coffee cooling by his elbows planted, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The overhead light was off. Only the small lamp over the sink threw a weak amber glow across the room, turning the edges of things soft and indistinct. Shadow lay stretched out under the table, the big dog's body a warm line against Daniel's boots, his head resting on his paws, but his eyes not fully closed. Every so often, the German shepherd's ears flicked at some distant sound outside, the rumble of a passing car, a dog barking 2 streets over, the faint wail of a train miles away. Each time, the dog processed the noise, decided it wasn't a threat, and let the tension leak away, only for another sound or another shift in Daniel's breathing to bring it back. Daniel's left hand moved almost of its own accord, fingers seeking the familiar weight of the military watch strapped around his wrist. His thumb traced the cool metal edge of the case, circling it slowly, then pausing over the small nicks and scratches on the glass. Each mark had come from somewhere: a fall on gravel, a scrape against a doorframe, a hurried climb into a helicopter years ago. The watch had kept time through it all, indifferent to whether the seconds it measured were easy or unbearable. Pressing his fingertips there now was like trying to reach back through skin and bone to the man he'd been when he first put it on, the one who believed that if he moved fast enough and did his job right, most people could be pulled out of the wreckage. "You're staring holes in that table," he muttered to himself, voice low in the dim room. The table did not argue. Shadow let out a soft, questioning whine, and Daniel looked down. In the lamp's glow, the dog's eyes reflected a faint gold, steady and present. "I hear you," Daniel said. "I know. The images from the abandoned house, the hard hat blackened by heat, the twisted metal fragments, and the faces of the men at the trucks looped through his mind like a film he couldn't shut off. He heard again the drawled warning, "Best not to dig too deep, Mr. Mercer," and felt the quiet, coiled menace beneath it. And before that, in another loop, Martha's voice on the farmyard, asking him whether he'd help her or just sell the land and walk away. The two loops overlapped now, weaving a knot that made his chest ache. Sleep didn't come anywhere near the house that night. He tried the usual tricks, turning on the television for background noise, washing the few dishes in the sink, even attempting to read an old paperback. But his mind slid off the words and back to the barn he hadn't yet inspected, the one building on the property he had only glanced at from a distance, the barn where, according to Martha, Henry had died, the barn that hadn't been mentioned in any detail in the sheriff's thin report. Shadow stayed close, following him from room to room, finally settling back under the kitchen table when Daniel returned to his chair, as if conceding that the night would not end easily. Somewhere around the hour when the town shifted from late night to early morning, when even the bars had gone quiet and only the lonely and the working were awake, Daniel stopped trying to bully himself into rest and made a decision instead. The watch's hands ticked calmly past 3. By dawn, when pale light seeped in around the kitchen curtains, he had not slept, but his resolve had hardened into something simple. If others were willing to go to such lengths to keep this story buried, then whatever lay under the surface deserved more than a shrug. The next morning, after a shower that did little to wash away the fatigue and a shave that left his jawline less rough, but his expression no less drawn, Daniel drove to the county courthouse again. He left Shadow at home this time. The dog watched him go with a tilted head and a brief huff of protest, then settled by the front door like an on-duty guardian. The day outside was clearer than the one before, the sky a high, brittle blue that made the courthouse's red brick stand out sharper. Daniel stepped into the main office of the county court, a different space from the records closet he'd visited the day before. This room was larger, with high ceilings, big windows letting in generous slices of light, and framed photographs of past judges staring down from the walls with solemn faces. Filing cabinets lined one side, desks with computers and stacks of folders filled the rest. Phones rang intermittently, keyboard keys clacked, and the low buzz of bureaucratic business filled the air. Behind one of the front desks sat Evelyn Kane. She was in her late 50s, though she carried it with the kind of unflustered confidence that made the number feel beside the point. Medium height, with a sturdy build softened at the edges, she had a face that would have been severe if not for the laugh lines etched permanently around her mouth and eyes. Her hair was a thick, wavy silver bob that brushed her jawline, neatly kept, and her eyes, a clear, penetrating gray, had the habit of landing on people as if they were documents to be read thoroughly. Today, she wore a navy blazer over a simple blouse, the clothing practical but well chosen, paired with small stud earrings that caught the light when she moved. As Daniel walked in, she looked up from the screen in front of her, blinked once in recognition, and then let a smile lift one corner of her mouth. "Well, I'll be damned," she said, in a voice that was low, textured, and entirely unhurried. "If it isn't Sergeant Mercer in From the Cold." He almost smiled at the old title. "Been a long time since anyone called me that," he said, approaching the desk. "And it's just Daniel now, last I checked." "Mm-hmm. And I'm just a simple clerk, and the sun rises in the west," she replied dryly, then softened the words with a warmer look. "You look tired, Danny." The use of the nickname from years back caught him off guard for half a second, but there was something steadying in it too, like a hand on his shoulder. "Didn't sleep much," he admitted. "I was hoping you might help with that." One of her brows arched, skeptical but curious. "Last time I checked, we don't issue sedatives at the county courthouse. What kind of help are you after?" He glanced around. The other clerks were absorbed in their work. A man in a suit stood at the far counter, arguing quietly with a younger clerk about a filing fee, and no one seemed particularly interested in the veteran in the plaid jacket. Still, he stepped a little closer and lowered his voice. "There's a property file I looked at yesterday," he said. "Ellison Farm, Reeves and Cole. And there's an incident report attached that smells wrong, Evie. Real wrong." Her eyes sharpened at the nickname she tolerated from only a handful of people. People. Wrong how? "Too clean," he said. "Too short. And some of the safety documents that should be in the system aren't." She leaned back in her chair, studying his face as if weighing how much of this was leftover paranoia from his past and how much was something else. "You think somebody lost them?" or somebody filed them where no one will ever look. Rita checked the boxes. We came up dry. He held her gaze. I think someone wanted it that way. Evelyn exhaled slowly, a small sound that wasn't quite a sigh. You have the worst timing. You know that? She said. We're up to our ears in arraignments and probate, and you stagger in here like some conscience in a flannel coat. Plaid, he corrected automatically. It was a tiny, ridiculous hill to stand on, but it made her lips twitch. Plaid then, she said. What do you want from me, Danny? I want copies, he said, of everything tied to that parcel. Land records, accident reports, any correspondence with Reeves and Cole, anything with Ellison's name on it. Quiet copies, off the record, somewhere safe, in case these files suddenly grow legs and walk away. Her eyes flicked toward the back offices, toward doors that led to judges' chambers and the DA's office, then back to him. You're asking me to act like I don't trust my own building, she said. I'm asking you to act like you've lived in this county long enough to know that sometimes paper falls into the wrong shredder, he replied. And I'm asking as someone who's seen men die because people look the other way. The words landed between them with a soft, heavy thud. For a moment, her jaw worked slightly as if she were chewing on something bitter. Then she nodded, once. You always did know how to ruin a perfectly good morning, she murmured. All right, here's how this is going to go. You give me the parcel number again. I'll pull what I can under the guise of a records audit. I make myself a little digital insurance policy and print a hard set for you. You keep it somewhere that's not your house. You sure? He asked. I don't want you catching heat. She gave him a look that could strip paint. I've been here 25 years, she said. I know where the heat comes from, and I know how close I can stand without getting burned. You just worry about what you're going to do once you have proof you might not want. He scribbled the parcel information on a sticky note and slid it across. She took it with 2 fingers. Then, before turning back to her computer, laid her hand briefly over his, a rare gesture. Be careful, Danny, she said softly. These people play for keeps. So do I, he answered. But he heard the tremor of doubt under his own confidence. By the time evening crept in, Daniel had a folder tucked under the seat of his truck, a slim thing, but heavier in implication than its thickness suggested. He hadn't opened it yet. Part of him wanted the plausible deniability of not knowing exactly what it contained. Another part itched to spread the pages out and draw lines between dates and signatures. Instead, as the sky darkened and the town's lights blinked on one by one, he pointed the truck back toward the Ellison farm. Shadow was with him again now, sitting upright, alert in the passenger seat. The dog had watched the folder's arrival with a kind of curious suspicion, nose twitching, as if he sensed that whatever was inside would change where their feet went next. Daniel timed his arrival so full dark would have fallen by the time he reached the property. There was a risk in that, he knew, but there was also cover. He didn't want to be seen walking into the barn in broad daylight, not after the visit from the men in the trucks. As he turned off the main road and onto the rutted path, he turned off his headlights and let the truck crawl forward under the pale wash of the rising moon. The outlines of the farmhouse and the barn emerged slowly from the shadows, familiar now, but no less unsettling. He parked the truck behind a stand of scrub trees rather than in the open yard, killed the engine, and sat for a second in the sudden silence. All right, boy, he whispered. Let's make this quick. Shadow jumped down lightly when he opened the door. The dog's shape a darker shadow against the dim yard. The air was colder than the night before, a bite in it that stung Daniel's nose and made his breath puff out in faint clouds. Somewhere in the distance, a coyote yipped, the sound thin and lonely. The farmhouse loomed to their left, but tonight his focus was on the barn. Even in the dark, its silhouette was clear, a long, low structure with a roof that sloped unevenly, one corner sagging like a shoulder, bearing too much weight. He approached from the side, keeping to the deeper shadows, flashlight in his pocket, but unused for now. Shadow padded ahead a few yards, then stopped, looking back to make sure Daniel was still with him before continuing. The barn door gave under his hand with a small, protesting creak when he eased it open just wide enough for them to slip through. Inside, the smell hit him first: old hay, dry wood, oil, and underneath it all, that stale tang of something once burned and long since cooled. He switched on the flashlight, shielding most of the beam with his fingers to narrow it. Dust motes swirled in the narrow cone of light. Discarded tools, rusted and forgotten, leaned against the walls. Empty stalls yawned on either side, their gates hanging crooked. Toward the center of the barn floor, though, something new cut through the old, a broad patch of concrete, smoother and a shade lighter than the rough, stained slab around it. It was maybe 6 feet by 6 feet, a distinct rectangle where the rest of the floor was pitted and cracked. There, he murmured. Shadow was already moving toward it, nose to the ground. The dog circled the patch once, twice, sniffing in tight spirals, his tail stiff, fur along his spine lifting. Then he stopped at one corner, pawed at the edge, and looked up at Daniel with a low bark that sounded almost impatient. "I see it," Daniel said. He slipped the crowbar he'd brought from the truck out of his jacket, a solid piece of metal, worn smooth, where hands had gripped it over years. Kneeling, he ran his free hand along the edge of the newer concrete. Up close, he could see where the old and new met, a thin line of roughness, small chips, and unevenness suggesting the original floor had been broken up here and then refilled. Someone had tried to cover something or remove something and patch over the scar. He wedged the flat end of the bar into a small crack near the corner and leaned his weight into it. The muscles in his shoulders and back protested the strain. He gritted his teeth and pushed harder. The concrete gave only grudgingly at first, small flakes crumbling under the pressure. Shadow paced nearby, then came to stand close by his side, as if bracing with him. Daniel shifted his angle, drove the bar in deeper, and pried again. This time, there was a dull, muffled crack, the sound of something brittle letting go beneath a stubborn surface. Just then, a faint smell threaded into the barn that didn't belong to old hay or oil. It was sharp, chemical, and unmistakable: gasoline. Daniel froze, breath caught halfway in his throat. Shadow's head snapped up, nose flaring, a growl rumbling deep from his chest. The dog turned toward the barn door, body taut, eyes bright in the dim. "Easy," Daniel whispered, automatically, though his heart had started to hammer against his ribs. He killed the flashlight with a quick flick of his thumb, plunging them into near darkness. Moonlight slid in through the gaps in the barn siding, carving the interior into faint stripes of silver and black. From where he crouched, he could see a thin line of light under the main door, the gap where wood didn't quite meet the ground. A shadow broke that line now, passing steadily along it. Through the crack, he saw the lower half of a pair of legs move by. The jeans dark, the boots heavy-soled, liquid sloshed softly in a container with each step, followed by the more distinct sound of it splashing out onto ground and siding. Whoever it was walked the perimeter of the barn with unhurried efficiency, pausing at intervals to upend the container. The smell of gasoline grew stronger, coiling through the gaps in the planks, reaching deep into Daniel's throat. He felt his gut clench. The footsteps returned to the front of the barn. Through the crack at the bottom of the door, he saw the glint of metal in a hand. The brief flare of a lighter flicked once, twice, then catching. For a heartbeat, the tiny flame burned steady, casting a small circle of orange on the boards. Then the hand tilted, and the flame dropped out of sight, kissing the line of fuel that had been poured there. Fire doesn't roar right away. It starts with a hiss, a quick, eager sound as it finds something to eat. The line of gasoline ignited in a racing tongue of orange that streaked along the base of the wall. And suddenly, the outside of the barn bloomed with light, flickering through the slats. "Back!" Daniel hissed, grabbing the loop of Shadow's collar. He shoved the crowbar into his belt and turned, guiding the dog toward the rear of the barn where he'd noticed a smaller service door when they came in. Smoke hadn't reached them yet, but it would, and fast. His boots pounded on the floorboards, Shadow's paws drumming beside him. Behind them, the outer walls crackled as flames climbed hungrily up dry wood. At the back, his fingers found the latch on the smaller door, rusty but still functional. He yanked it up and threw his shoulder against the door. For a second, it stuck, then jerked open with a shriek of protesting hinges. Cold night air flooded in, carrying with it the first harsh tendrils of smoke curling around the barn. Daniel pushed Shadow through the opening first, the dog leaping out into the grass, then followed, stumbling slightly as his legs adjusted from the dim interior to the moonlit yard. They were only a few yards from the barn when the fire truly caught. The flames roared now, fed by old dry wood and fresh gasoline, shooting out of cracks and broken boards, licking at the eaves. Heat washed over Daniel's face in a hot, dry wave, making his eyes water. He turned, instinctively putting a hand on Shadow's back, as if to shield him, though the dog seemed more focused than frightened, ears pinned, eyes wide. From their angle behind the structure, they couldn't see the arsonist's face, only the silhouette of a figure moving away into the dark, outlined briefly against the blaze before disappearing toward the fields. No one shouted. No one called for help. The only sounds were the crack, pop, and roar of the burning barn and the distant, indifferent night. Daniel stood there, chest heaving, feeling the urge to run in two directions at once, toward the fire to salvage whatever he could, and away from it before whoever had lit it turned back for witnesses. Instead, he stayed rooted for a long moment, watching as the barn, the place where Henry Ellison had died, the place where someone had poured new concrete over old secrets, was swallowed in light and turned into a furnace. In the glow, Shadow's eyes reflected twin pinpricks of red gold, deep and steady. The dog's gaze slid from the fire up to Daniel's face, as if asking a question Daniel had been avoiding. He realized, with a clarity that cut through the heat and smoke, that whoever he was up against was willing to burn wood, memories, and flesh alike to keep the truth buried, and that the time for standing on the sidelines of this story had just gone up in flames with the barn. By the time the smoke from the barn had thinned into a smudge on the horizon, the official story was already taking shape without Daniel's help. The next day, a short notice went up on the county's incident log: structure fire at disused outbuilding on former Ellison property. Probable cause: electrical fault in aged wiring. No mention of gasoline. No mention of a figure walking the perimeter with a can. No mention of a man and a dog slipping out the back door with their hearts pounding in their throats. At the diner, Daniel overheard a couple of farmers shaking their heads over coffee, muttering that it was a shame about that old barn finally going up. But what could you expect with wiring that old? At the hardware store, someone joked about Reeves and Cole finally getting a clean slate to build on. The town accepted the script because it made everything simpler, and simple stories were easier to live with than the kind that made you look twice at your neighbors. For Daniel, though, simplicity had burned away with the barn's roof. 2 days after the fire, he sat at his desk in the small real estate office on Main Street, the front window painted with his name in modest gold letters, watching rain streak the glass in thin, uncertain lines. The spring storm hadn't quite gathered its full strength yet. The sky was the color of old pewter, and the wind kept changing its mind. A stack of listing folders sat neatly to his left, but he hadn't opened them all morning. His computer screen showed an email from Reeves and Cole's regional office, each line more urgent and more polite than the last. Concern about liability, talk of public safety, phrases like prudently decommission and mitigate risk. In plain language, it meant they wanted everything on that land flattened and removed as quickly as possible, and they wanted him to make the paperwork go down easy. The bell on the front door jingled, a small, bright sound that made Shadow lift his head from where he'd been dozing behind the desk. The dog stood smoothly, tail low but alert, as the man who stepped inside shook rein from the shoulders of a dark, expensive-looking overcoat. He was in his mid-40s, Daniel guessed, with the practiced neatness of someone who spent more time in offices than in fields. Medium height, a bit soft around the middle in a gym-maintained way, with a clean-shaven jaw and dark hair swept back from a high forehead. His face might have been handsome if it weren't for the faint downturn at the corners of his mouth, and the way his eyes, pale hazel, cool, and assessing, seemed to appraise the room the way a surveyor appraised a lot. A sleek leather briefcase hung from one hand. The other reached up automatically to smooth a wrinkle at his tie, a deep navy that matched the sheen of his suit. Everything about him, from the polished shoes to the subtle watch at his wrist, said money and the comfort of having it. "Mr. Mercer," he said, the words coated in an easy, professional warmth that never quite made it past his teeth. His voice carried a faint city accent, smoothed over with years of conference calls. "Appreciate you seeing me on short notice." Daniel rose from his chair, the movement unhurried. He wore his usual uniform: plaid jacket, cream shirt, dark jeans, but somehow, in the muted office light, he seemed more solid than the man across from him, like a tree that had grown where it stood rather than been transplanted. "Doors open during business hours," Daniel replied. "You must be with Reeves and Cole." The man stepped forward and offered a hand. His grip was firm, just shy of aggressive. "Guilty as charged. Aaron Whitfield," he said, "Regional Acquisitions Manager." The title rolled off his tongue like something practiced in a mirror. Shadow edged closer, standing slightly to the side of Daniel's leg, eyes fixed on Whitfield's face. The dog's ears were pricked, his body language polite, but not welcoming. "What can I do for you, Mr. Whitfield?" Daniel asked, motioning toward the chair across from his desk. Whitfield sat, crossing one leg over the other with casual precision, then set the briefcase on his knee and clicked it open. "I'm sure you've seen the reports about the unfortunate incident with the old barn," he began. "Our people are quite concerned. Liability issues, you understand. These old structures, they're ticking time bombs. Frankly, we're lucky no one was hurt." Daniel thought of the heat on his back as he pushed Shadow through the rear door, the roar of flames catching dry wood. "Lucky?" he echoed neutrally. "We take community safety very seriously, Mr. Mercer," Whitfield continued, sliding a crisp folder from the briefcase. "The last thing we want is some curious teenager or trespasser hurting themselves out there. That's why we're moving forward with plans to remove all remaining unsafe structures and remediate the land. Clean slate, good for everyone." He placed the folder on the desk and opened it, revealing a sheaf of papers, and atop them, a check held down by a paperclip. The numbers printed on the check were large enough to pull the eye like gravity. Even upside down, Daniel could see the commas. "We also understand that recent events may have given you—" "Pause," Whitfield said, his tone smoothing out further. "Change can be unsettling. And at your stage in life, I imagine peace of mind is worth more than a few extra headaches." He tapped the check lightly with one manicured finger. "This is a gesture of good faith. A consultancy bonus, you might call it. All we need from you is your continued cooperation as listing agent and your signature on these documents acknowledging the property's current condition and supporting expedited clearance." He smiled then, a small, practiced lift of the lips that didn't shift anything in his eyes. "You've done your part. You found us a problem. Let us handle the solution." Daniel sat back slowly, folding his hands loosely in front of him. For a moment, he just listened to the faint patter of rain on the window and the steady sound of Shadow's breathing behind him. "That's a lot of money to ask me to sign what you already wrote," he said. "You must really want this done fast." Whitfield chuckled, as if they were sharing a joke. "Speed is efficiency, Mr. Mercer. We have investors, timelines. The longer a site sits idle, the more it costs everyone. I'd think a man in your line of work would appreciate that." "In my line of work," Daniel replied quietly, "I've learned that the details you rush past are usually the ones that come back to bite you." He reached out, not for the pen, but for the edge of the folder, flipping the top page just enough to see the language. Phrases leaped out. "No known unresolved safety inquiries. No evidence of prior hazardous industrial use. All incidents attributed to structural age and electrical failure." Martha's voice echoed in his mind, talking about men in suits, about being told her husband's death was just bad luck. "See, that's the beauty of it," Whitfield said smoothly, mistaking Daniel's silence for consideration. "You sign, we clear, everyone moves on. You get a very comfortable cushion to enjoy your retirement, and this town gets a modern, safe development bringing jobs and tax revenue. You stay in the game, of course. Plenty of houses to sell once we build. It's a win-win." Daniel lifted his gaze from the paper to Whitfield's face. "And if I don't sign?" he asked. The representative's expression didn't change much. The smile thinned, but didn't vanish. "Then you complicate things," he said candidly. "We'll still proceed. We have other avenues. But it'll be messier, slower. I'd hate to see the county tied up in red tape over something that could have been handled quietly. Folks don't like red tape. Sometimes they look around for someone to blame." His pale eyes held Daniel's. "You've built a nice, quiet life here, Mr. Mercer. It would be a shame to sour it in the last quarter." Shadow's growl was too low for anyone outside the room to hear, but it vibrated through the floorboards into Daniel's boots. He reached down and brushed his fingers over the top of the dog's head. A slight, calming pressure. "I've seen what your solutions look like," Daniel said, voice still even. "The barn burned awfully fast for old wiring, and the reports on Mr. Ellison's death are thin." Whitfield's gaze cooled another few degrees. "You're not an engineer, Mr. Mercer," he said, "nor are you law enforcement anymore. Sometimes unfortunate things happen. Trying to hang a narrative on every broken wire is a good way to drive yourself crazy." He nudged the check closer. "You've done your duty. You raised your concerns. No one can say you didn't. This," he tapped the paper again, "is us acknowledging your diligence. Take care of yourself. Let the rest of us worry about the rest." For a moment, Daniel imagined a different version of himself. One who took the check, signed the line, and walked away. He saw the relief in paying off the last of the mortgage, the ease of not looking over his shoulder, the quiet of going back to showing bungalows and ranch houses, pretending barns didn't burn for reasons. Then he pictured Martha's trailer rattling in the wind, Lucas hugging that old cat like a life preserver, the way Shadow's eyes had glowed in the firelight as the barn went up. He slid the check back to the center of the folder with 2 fingers. "I'm not signing," he said. Whitfield watched the motion, then closed the folder carefully, as if handling something fragile that had cracked. When he spoke again, his voice had lost all pretense of warmth. "You're putting yourself in an awkward position," he said. "Right now, you're the only local intermediary on this project. The only one standing between us and a clean resolution. That's not a comfortable place to be." "Comfort's overrated," Daniel replied. "Good night, Mr. Whitfield." The man's jaw worked once, a muscle ticking at the corner. Then he stood, buttoned his coat with brisk movements, and picked up the briefcase. "You're not a young man anymore," he said, pausing at the door. "You survived one line of work. Might be wise not to go looking for another kind of war this late in the game." He stepped out into the rain without waiting for an answer. The bell jingled behind him, small and bright in the dim office, and then the sound of his footsteps faded down the sidewalk. Shadow came around the desk and rested his head heavily on Daniel's knee. Daniel let his hand sink into the thick fur, staring out at the gray street. The decision was made. The line was drawn. The rest would come, one way or another. That night, the storm the sky had been threatening finally arrived. Clouds rolled in thick and low, turning the world outside Daniel's truck windshield into a blur of dark shapes and streaks of water. Lightning flickered along the horizon in jagged veins, followed seconds later by the low, rolling growl of thunder. The wind pushed at the sides of the truck as he drove back out toward the Ellison property, the wipers working hard to keep up. Shadow sat braced in the passenger seat, the occasional flash of light reflecting off his eyes, making them seem for a heartbeat like small, steady lanterns in the dark cab. Daniel turned off the main road and onto the familiar ruts, feeling the truck bump and sway. Up ahead, the farmhouse and the smoldering absence of the barn were swallowed by the night. But one small box of light glowed. Martha's trailer, a rectangle of yellow against the black. As he approached, he killed his headlights and slowed. Something was wrong. Parked on the shoulder just beyond the trailer, half hidden by the blowing rain, was a dark sedan Daniel didn't recognize. It wasn't one of the local beat-up pickups or dusty SUVs. This car was newer, low to the ground, with a glossy finish that glistened even in the storm. Its engine was off, but its presence hummed like a question in the wet air. Daniel pulled his truck off the road a good distance back, angling it behind a clump of trees. He sat with the engine idling low, watching. The sedan's windows were dark, the interior opaque. No one got out, no lights flashed. It just sat there, a quiet silhouette watching the trailer. Shadow's hackles lifted, the fur along his spine rising under Daniel's hand. A deep, steady growl built in the dog's chest. Not the sharp warning bark for a passing stranger, but a longer, more serious note that said he recognized something about this stillness as dangerous. Easy, Daniel murmured, though his own pulse had started to climb. He watched the trailer. Through the thin curtains, he could see movement. A shadow that had to be Martha passing in front of the kitchen window, then another, smaller shape that must be Lucas. For a moment, the boy's outline paused, hand lifting as if to touch the glass. Then it was gone. The storm wind picked up, rattling the branches overhead and making the trailer shudder slightly on its blocks. Rain hammered the metal roof in an unsteady drumbeat. Lightning split the sky closer now, white blue light washing the field and the parked sedan in stark contrast. In that instant, Daniel thought he saw the outline of someone in the driver's seat, head turned toward the trailer, still as a statue. Then the world plunged back into shadow. He couldn't prove the car belonged to anyone from Reeves and Cole. Couldn't prove it was anything more than a lost traveler waiting out the worst of the storm. But in his gut, the same instincts that had once kept him alive in places far from this quiet county told him that the sedan was not lost, and the driver was not waiting for the weather to clear. It felt like a test of nerve, a reminder that Martha's thin walls were no protection against pressure. Daniel's hand closed around the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles creaked. Shadow whined once, turning from the window to look up at him, as if asking what they were going to do about it. "I know," Daniel said hoarsely. "I know." He couldn't just storm up to the stranger's car in the rain and demand answers. That would be playing on their terms. He couldn't drag Martha and Lucas out into the storm with no clear place to take them. Not yet. The question rattled in his chest. Get them out while he still could, or stand the ground they had left, even if it trembled under their feet. Thunder cracked overhead, closer and sharper. The cab of the truck lit up briefly with another blast of lightning, and at the same moment his phone vibrated in his jacket pocket, buzzing against his ribs. He pulled it out, thumbed the screen. Evelyn's name glowed there. He answered on the first ring. "Danny," her voice came, barely muffled by the storm's noise. There was no time for preamble. "I sent everything, every copy we made, land records, incident reports, your notes. It's all in a package on a desk at the state attorney's office as of an hour ago. They called back. They're interested." A beat of silence, filled by the sound of rain on metal and Shadow's breath. That means they'll move, she went on, and it means the people you're poking at will feel it. You've got a window, a small one, before they realize how much trouble they're in. Be careful who you stand next to until then. Daniel looked from the glowing screen to the distant rectangle of Martha's trailer, then to the dark shape of the waiting sedan. The storm outside and the one inside him seemed to collide, and he understood with a sudden, cold clarity that whatever was going to happen next would happen soon, and likely hard. The storm had been working at the house for hours, rattling the windows and worrying the front door in fits and starts, so that Daniel had half convinced himself the real danger was in his imagination, and the world outside was only rain and wind. Sometime after midnight, though, when the television's low murmur had turned into nothing more than a flicker of color across his unseeing eyes, the sound that tore him fully awake was not thunder, it was shadow. Not the quick, questioning bark the dog gave for a squirrel on the porch or a car door slamming down the street, but a sustained, guttural growl that started deep in his chest and spilled out in a warning Daniel felt in his bones. The German Shepherd stood rigid in the doorway to the hall, fur along his spine raised in a dark ridge, eyes fixed toward the front of the house. The gusts outside made the old wood creak, but the dog wasn't looking at the door. He was looking past it, toward the slice of night visible through the living room window. "What is it, boy?" Daniel rasped, already pushing himself up from the armchair. His body protested the quick movement, stiff knees, tired back, but adrenaline sanded the edges off the aches. He crossed to the window in 3 long strides, Shadow pacing at his side, and pulled the curtain back with the edge of his fingers. Through the rolling veil of rain, the town was mostly darkness, punctured by a few streetlights. Beyond the last few houses, out toward the black line where the land dipped into the Ellison property, something wrong colored the sky, a low, pulsing orange that didn't belong to lightning. For a heartbeat, he told himself it was just his mind painting the storm with the memory of the barn. But then another gust cleared the rain just enough, and he saw it, a smear of flame licking upward from ground level, hugging the outline of something squat and man-made. His heart dropped. The trailer. Damn it, he breathed. Shadow gave another of those low, urgent sounds, already wheeling toward the door. Daniel grabbed his plaid jacket from the hook, shrugging it on over his t-shirt, the fabric almost a second skin by now. He jammed his feet into his worn brown boots without bothering with the laces, snatched his truck keys from the bowl by the door, and was out on the porch in seconds, the storm hitting him like a living thing. Rain stung his face, driven sideways by the wind, and his hair and shoulders were soaked before he reached the truck. Shadow leapt into the passenger seat as soon as the door opened, turning to face forward with his body poised like a coiled spring, eyes on the road ahead even before Daniel got the engine roaring. Gravel sprayed under the tires as he reversed out of the drive and then swung the truck around toward the dark stretch of county road that led to the farm. Every time the wipers cleared the windshield, the distant glow looked larger. "Hang on, Martha," he muttered, one hand white-knuckled on the wheel, the other flicking on the high beams. The storm seemed determined to shove him off the road, but the old instincts that had driven vehicles in worse conditions than this took over. He let the truck find the ruts it already knew, corrected for the wind without thinking about it. Beside him, Shadow braced his paws on the floorboard, leaning with the turns, eyes fixed on that growing patch of fire. As they crested the last low rise, The Ellison trailer came fully into view, and for a moment Daniel forgot to breathe. Flame had caught along one corner of the metal box, clinging to insulation and siding as though it had been waiting for an excuse. Someone had either poured accelerant or the world had decided to prove every one of his fears at once, because the fire wasn't creeping. It was climbing, reaching eagerly up toward the roofline. The old wooden shed that squatted a few yards away already had tongues of fire tasting its eaves. The connection between them, a line of burning debris and dry grass. The barn was gone. The shed was going. And between them, in that cheap rectangle of metal and fiberglass, were a 60-year-old woman and a 10-year-old boy. Daniel swung the truck in hard, skidding to a stop in the yard with one rear tire up on the edge of a rut. Before the engine had fully died, Shadow was out the door and onto the mud, racing toward the trailer with a speed and purpose that made Daniel's throat tighten. The wind flung smoke and sparks around the clearing, the air a wild mix of hot and cold that made his eyes water as he ran. "Martha!" he shouted over the gale and the crackle of flame. "Martha!" There was no answer from inside, but he could hear coughing, thin and desperate, muffled by metal walls. Shadow threw himself at the trailer's flimsy steps, scrambling up and planting his front paws against the door, barking now in sharp, frantic bursts. He scratched at the metal with his nails, then pivoted to look at Daniel and back at the door, as if to say there wasn't time for nuance. Daniel took the steps, two at a time, the heat already radiating through the thin trailer wall, searing the skin on the back of his neck. He grabbed the handle. It was hot, but not yet unbearable. He twisted and yanked, throwing his shoulder against the door. It resisted for a second, swollen from heat or jammed by fear from the inside, then gave way with a screech. A wave of smoke rolled out, thick and acrid, carrying with it the desperate sound of a child's cough. "Lucas!" he shouted, dropping low by instinct, where the air was marginally clearer. "Kiddo, you've got to come to my voice. Now!" In the dim, flickering light from the fire licking up the outside wall, he saw a small form stumbling down the narrow hall, too small to be anyone but the boy. Lucas's face was streaked with soot, his eyes wide and streaming, his t-shirt clinging damply to his thin frame. He coughed so hard his whole body spasmed. One hand clamped around the neck of the old cat he refused to let go of. The other reached blindly forward. I can't see," the boy wheezed, panic slicing through the words. "It hurts." "I've got you," Daniel said, closing the distance in 2 strides. He scooped Lucas up, boy and cat together, ignoring the protest in his back. Lucas coughed against his chest, then latched his small arms around Daniel's neck, fingertips digging in. As they turned toward the door, Shadow forced his way partway inside, planting himself so the boy's hand brushed his fur. Lucas's grip shifted, one arm snaking around the dog's thick neck like he was holding on to a floating log in a flood. The cat, bless its scared, stubborn heart, dug its claws into Daniel's jacket and stayed put. Outside, Martha's voice finally pierced the chaos, hoarse and high. "Lucas! Lucas!" She appeared at the base of the steps, hair plastered to her head by rain, nightgown thrown on under a hastily grabbed coat, bare feet splattered with mud. Her face was terror and fury wrapped in one as she reached up. Daniel thrust the boy into her arms, the cat tumbling with him, and for a moment all three clung together in the storm. The fire along the trailer's side roared louder as it found something new to feed on, and Daniel felt the heat on his cheeks like an accusation. "Get back!" he shouted over the din, gesturing toward the truck. "Behind the truck, away from the shed. Go!" Martha nodded, stunned but responsive, half dragging, half carrying Lucas toward the shadow of the vehicle. Shadow circled once, as if counting heads, then returned to Daniel's side, close enough that their shoulders brushed. That was when Daniel saw the other figures. Through the wall of rain and smoke, on the far side of the yard, near the line where the old fence separated the Ellison lot from the road, a pair of headlights suddenly cut through the dark, then died. The sedan from earlier, or one just like it, sat there like a waiting insect, dark and sleek. Its driver's door was open now, and a man stood beside it, umbrella held loosely over his head, as if this were nothing more than an inconvenient drizzle. The umbrella's shadow obscured much of his face, but as he stepped closer, into the quivering light thrown by the fire, Daniel saw him clearly. Colton Reeves was in his early 50s, with the fit, contained body of someone who paid others to worry about real labor and paid a trainer to keep the years from settling too comfortably on his frame. He wore a dark overcoat that fit him like it had been measured down to the last inch. The collar turned up just enough to frame a jaw that looked carved. His hair, thick and mostly dark with a few tasteful strands of silver at the temples, was slicked back away from a broad forehead. Even in the storm, his shoes shone. But it was his eyes that made Daniel's stomach tighten. Pale, almost colorless in the leaping light, scanning the scene with an attention that felt less like concern and more like a contractor checking off a punch list. Beside him stood another man, a few years younger, maybe late 30s, shoulders broader, dressed in a heavy work jacket and jeans. His hair was buzzed short, his nose crooked from at least one break, and his gaze never held in one place for long. Rain beaded on the brim of his cap as he watched the flames, one hand resting with too much familiarity on the shape beneath his coat where a gun sat. "Quite a show, isn't it?" Colton called over the wind, voice carrying with an ease that said he was used to being heard. He walked forward a few steps, shoes sinking slightly into the muddy ground, but he didn't seem bothered by it. Those old trailers go up like kindling. Whoever signed off on leaving someone living in that death trap ought to be ashamed. Daniel took a step to meet him, placing himself between Colton and the huddled shapes behind the truck. Shadow paced in perfect sync with him, muscles taut. Smoke clawed at Daniel's throat, but his voice came out steady enough. "Somebody helped it along," he said. "Fire doesn't jump to exactly the right corner at exactly the right hour by accident. Not twice." Colton's mouth curled at the edge in something that wasn't quite a smile. "Funny thing about accidents," he said, coming closer still until the glow picked out the fine lines at the corners of his eyes. "People think they mean no one's responsible. The truth is, someone's always responsible. It's just a question of who's smart enough to stay off the paperwork." Behind him, the bigger man shifted his weight, eyes flicking from the flames to Daniel and back again. The wind flapped the edge of his jacket briefly, and Daniel caught a clearer glimpse of the matte black of a holstered pistol. His pulse stumbled, then steadied. He slipped his hand into his jacket pocket slowly, as if simply seeking warmth, and felt the familiar rectangle of his phone. With a practiced thumb movement, he unlocked it by feel and tapped the icon he knew by muscle memory. A faint vibration against his palm told him the recorder was running. "Is that what Henry Ellison was?" Daniel asked, forcing the words out through the hot air. "An accident someone got smart about?" Colton's laugh was quiet, almost indulgent. "Mr. Mercer," he said, pronouncing the name like a mild rebuke, "you are, if nothing else, persistent. You should have taken Aaron's check. Men in your position usually understand when to bow out gracefully." He glanced toward the burning trailer, then back. Ellison was stubborn, thought his granddaddy's signature on a deed meant he could stand in the way of progress. We extended him every courtesy, safety guidelines, partnership offers. He wanted to do things his way. His way was cheap. The pale eyes hardened. Cheap breaks. Cheap explodes. And in this state, when something breaks because a stubborn old man ignored the experts, do you know what they call it? An accident, Daniel said. The word tasted like ash. Exactly, Colton replied. And the system. He spread his hands in a gesture that somehow encompassed the county, the state, maybe the whole country, is designed to encourage investment, not punish it. A few calls, a few donations in the right race, and people see sense. They let the paperwork close the way it should. Families get paid, eventually. Investors get to build something the world needs. Everyone wins more than they lose. Lightning ripped across the sky, lighting his face from the side, throwing sharp shadows under his eyes. In that moment, Daniel saw the casual certainty there, the absolute belief that money not only smoothed roads, but rewrote the map for everyone else. Everyone, Daniel echoed. You mean you. You get to strip the ground and call it progress, and anyone who doesn't move fast enough gets turned into a line in a report, if they're lucky. Behind him, he heard Martha cough again, a raw, wet sound. Shadow's ears flicked at the noise, then came back to Colton, the dog's growl starting again, deeper this time. Colton's gaze ticked once toward the trailer, where the fire was now mostly chewing on the outer wall and the shed beside it. "What I mean," he said, "is that there are people in this town who'd be very upset if some self-righteous retiree decided to blow up an opportunity that could change their economic future. And I mean that I'm not in the habit of letting sentimental stories about widows and their shacks get in the way of a multi-million-dollar mineral deposit." The word mineral slipped out with a little more weight than he seemed to intend, like a stone falling through water. Daniel caught it. "So that's what's under there," he said softly. "Not just good grazing. Silver? Natural gas? Whatever it is, it's worth enough to buy a sheriff, an inspector, a county board." Colton's eyes sharpened. For a second, he looked almost annoyed with himself, as if he'd dropped a card too early in the game. Then he shrugged, the motion minimal under his coat. "A smart man," he said, "would put his phone away before he asked questions like that out loud." The heavier man at his side shifted again, and this time his hand came fully inside his jacket. Daniel saw the gun clear leather, dark and ugly in the firelight, the barrel coming up in a smooth, familiar arc that said its owner had done this more than once. He had just enough time to register the angle. Toward him, toward Martha and Lucas behind him, maybe both, when Shadow moved. The germanShepherd exploded from stillness into motion, a streak of muscle and instinct cutting through the mud. He slammed into the gunman's side with all his weight, teeth snapping for the man's forearm. The shot went off anyway, but the barrel was jostled skyward. The bullet screamed into the storm instead of into flesh, lightning answering with its own crack an instant later. Man and dog went down in a tangle, the gun skidding away in the mud. "Shadow!" Daniel shouted, every nerve screaming to join the fight. But he held himself back half a heartbeat, because something else was happening too. Over the storm's roar and the dying barn's crackle, another sound rose, the high, keening wail of sirens. Not the old, warbling county cruiser tone, but the cleaner, newer scream of state patrol cars, growing louder by the second. Red and blue light flickered at the edge of the road, first as distant flashes, then as full, pulsing washes of color as two, then three vehicles surged into view, tires throwing up sheets of water. Colton's head snapped toward the sound, his mask of calm cracking for the first time. "What did you do?" he hissed. Daniel lifted the hand with the phone, the screen slick with rain, the little red dot of the recorder icon glowing faintly. "You're not the only one who knows how to make calls," he said, "and you talk too much when you think no one's listening." The yard filled with slamming doors and shouted commands. Uniformed figures poured out of the cars, broad-brimmed hats pulled low against the rain, pistols drawn, but held with the disciplined angles of people used to being the ones who set the rules. "State police!" a voice boomed. "Hands where we can see them, now!" The gunman on the ground tried to scramble for the weapon, but Shadow was on him. Jaws latched onto the man's jacket sleeve, dragging him just enough that he overbalanced. Two troopers closed in, boots splashing mud, one kicking the pistol farther away with a practiced sweep, the other grabbing the man's arms and snapping cuffs around his wrists. Shadow backed off at Daniel's sharp whistle, teeth bared but under control, chest heaving. Another pair of troopers approached Colton. For the first time, the man looked smaller, not physically, but in the way his certainty seemed to shrink as he realized the audience had changed. "This is a misunderstanding," he began, the old smoothness rushing back as he straightened his spine. "I'm the property owner here. My lawyer—" "Your lawyer can meet you at the station," one of the officers cut in. A woman in her 40s, with rain streaming off the brim of her hat and a face that had seen enough midnight calls. "We have a recording of you discussing bribery, cover-ups, and unsafe extraction practices with a witness on scene, plus an attempted shooting. Turn around." Her tone left no room for negotiation. For a moment, Daniel thought Colton would resist. That pride and panic would make him stupid. But then the man's shoulders sagged, just a little, and he turned, placing his hands behind his back with theatrical slowness. The cuffs clicked shut with a sound that cut through the wind, final and small. As they led him toward one of the cruisers, he twisted, his head back over his shoulder, eyes seething. "You think this fixes anything?" he spat, rain and spit mixing. "You think a little mud and a few flames and some grandstanding will change what this land is worth? They'll still come. With or without me, they'll come." Daniel stood in the rain, clothes plastered to his skin, hair dripping into his eyes. Shadow pressed close enough that their sides touched. "Maybe," he called back, "but at least now they'll have to do it in the open." Colton snarled something wordless as they pushed him into the back seat and slammed the door. The lights painted his face in pulses of red and blue until the car pulled away down the lane, siren rising again as it disappeared toward town. Around them, the storm kept raging, indifferent. The trailer's fire had been knocked down by the rain and began to gutter, leaving blackened scars along the metal. The shed was a collapsed skeleton, still steaming. Martha and Lucas huddled behind the truck, the boy's hand buried in Shadow's wet fur. Daniel's muscles began to register the chill at last, the way his fingers had gone numb without him noticing, the ache in his chest that had nothing to do with smoke. He bent, resting a hand on Shadow's neck, feeling the dog's heartbeat thudding steady and strong under his palm. Sirens faded. The troopers moved through the yard like purposeful ghosts, stringing tape, taking statements, turning chaos into lines on forms. Daniel looked out over the charred ground, the scorched trailer, the darkness beyond where the barn had once stood. And for a moment, standing there soaked and shivering with the weight of what had just happened pressing down on him, he wondered if anything on this land could ever be more than ashes and painful memories again. In the weeks that followed the night of fire, the storms that rolled over the county were quieter ones, the kind that rinsed winter grit off the streets and left everything smelling faintly of damp earth and new grass. But for Daniel, the real weather was in the courthouse and in the thick envelopes that arrived with state seals pressed into their flaps. He watched the investigation unfold the way a man watches a slow, careful surgery on a body everyone had insisted was healthy. A cut here, a cut there. The first thin slices revealing things beneath the skin no one wanted to name. State investigators, men and women in sensible suits with tired eyes and notepads, crossed in and out of the sheriff's office and the county administration building. Their cars lined up along Main Street like a row of punctuation marks. They weren't the swaggering type. Most looked like people who had spent too much time in fluorescent-lit rooms, but their questions were sharp, and they did not seem interested in the easy answers that had sufficed for years. Daniel saw them from a distance often enough. A tall black woman in her 40s, with her hair pulled back in a neat bun, and glasses that flashed when she tilted her head. A shorter, stocky man in a rumpled blazer whose face seemed permanently stuck between patient and exasperated. He spoke with them when asked, sitting at conference tables with plastic cups of lukewarm coffee, Shadow lying at his feet like a shadow carved out of fur and muscle, ears flicking whenever the word Ellison or incident came up. In those rooms, he told the parts of the story that belonged on the record, what he'd seen in the barn, what he'd heard from Colton under the storm, what had been captured by the tiny red dot of his phone's recorder. The investigators listened, asked their questions again in slightly different words, scribbled their notes. Sometimes, when one of them left a file open for a moment too long, he caught glimpses of other names on other pages. Families from neighboring counties whose accidents suddenly looked like pieces on the same board. Newspaper headlines began to change tone as the weeks went by. The first had been cautiously neutral. State officials probe local development firm. Then, as the story deepened and leaked beyond the county line, the words grew heavier. Pattern of safety violations tied to Reeves and Cole projects. Questions raised over accidental deaths in rural development. Daniel didn't revel in any of it, but when he saw Henry Ellison's name printed in a font larger than an obituary for the first time, unaccompanied by the word tragedy, and instead framed by wrongful and investigation, something in his chest loosened. He took that paper out to the burned edge of the old farm one afternoon and stood with it fluttering in his hand, Shadow sitting solemnly by his side, and read the first paragraph aloud to the empty yard, as if Henry might be listening. It wasn't justice, Not yet, but it was the beginning of the world saying out loud what had been true all along. The official decisions came down slowly, like the thaw. One day, the investigators stopped coming and the state attorney stopped asking for clarifications. Weeks later, at a meeting in the same county boardroom where Daniel had once watched men in suits talk about zoning, like they were discussing the weather, a representative from the state read from a prepared statement. The Ellison property and several adjacent parcels, the statement said, would be placed into a special trust overseen jointly by state and local appointees, with independent auditors. Any future extraction of minerals or resources on that land would be subject to stricter regulation than anything the county had seen in decades. And, this was the part that made the room murmur, the majority of net profits from such extraction would be directed into two channels: a compensation fund for families harmed by past negligence, and a community development fund earmarked specifically for services to the county's aging residents. It was not the kind of thing people here were used to hearing. The room smelled of coffee and old carpet and the faint tang of sweat as farmers, small business owners, and retirees sat shoulder to shoulder on metal chairs, listening. Martha was there, in a clean blouse and her best skirt, Lucas beside her, fidgeting with the brim of a borrowed ball cap. Evelyn sat a few rows back, legal pad in hand, out of habit, her expression unreadable, but her eyes bright. Daniel felt oddly like a man watching his own life being reorganized into bullet points. When the representative mentioned his name, Mr. Daniel Mercer has agreed to serve as an advisor to the trust in an unpaid capacity, offering his perspective as both a veteran and a local business owner. The room turned as one to look at him. He shifted awkwardly in his seat, one hand dropping automatically to brush against Shadow's head. Later, a couple of old-timers clapped him on the shoulder on the way out, their compliments blunt and brief, the way men here handled anything resembling praise. "You did good, Mercer," one said, an ex-farmer with sun-leathered skin and a cap advertising seed corn. "Damn fool thing to get tangled in, but you did good." That night, when the house was quiet and the sky was clear for the first time in days, Daniel sat at his kitchen table with the trust paperwork spread out in front of him. The words blurred a little around the edges, legal phrases he'd never bothered to learn when he was young and convinced the world would be decided by action, not clauses. He caught his reflection faintly in the window, hair more gray than not, lines around his mouth deeper than they'd been even a year ago. And for a brief, treacherous moment, that old whisper stirred. "You're too late. You're too old. You made your worst mistake 20 years back, and no amount of standing up now erases that." Then he felt the solid weight of Shadow's head come to rest on his knee, the dog's warm breath huffing gently against his thigh as if to call him back to the room he was actually in. And he thought of Martha's hands around a new set of house keys, of Lucas's laugh the first time he'd run across a field that wasn't haunted by the memory of a body, of the quiet nod Evelyn had given him when the meeting ended. Maybe you can't erase, he thought, but you can write something over the top of it. Spring tiptoed into summer, while crews in hard hats and safety vests moved carefully across parts of the land with clipboards and equipment, not to strip it bare in secret this time, but to map it honestly. On another corner of the property, far from the scars of the burned barn and trailer, a different kind of building went up, It wasn't large or fancy, just a sturdy one-story structure with wide doors, big windows, and a generous covered porch that wrapped around two sides. The plans, someone had explained at a trust meeting, called it a senior community center, but the older folks in town just started referring to it as the Hall or the place out at Ellison's as soon as the foundation was poured. Daniel watched it grow from a rectangle of chalk lines in the dirt to a skeleton of beams to a building that caught the late afternoon light on its new siding. Not far from it, on a gentle rise that had been bare brush before, a small wooden house took shape. Simple lines. A front step instead of a grand porch, but solid, with good insulation and windows that didn't rattle in the wind. One morning, he drove out with Shadow riding shotgun and arrived just as the last of the scaffolding was being taken down from that smaller house. Martha stood in the front yard, arms crossed, expression hovering somewhere between disbelief and stubborn determination not to cry. She wore her hair pulled back, and the deep lines around her mouth seemed softer than they had in the old trailer's yellow light. Lucas ran in and out of the front door, sheriff's hat long since replaced by a battered baseball cap, his voice rising in delighted echoes. "Grandma, it's warm in here. Grandma, the floor doesn't squeak." The cat, impossibly, had survived everything and now sat like a lord in the new front window, tail flicking lazily. A representative from the trust, a woman in her 30s, with kind eyes and a tired smile, handed Martha a manila envelope with final papers inside and said words like life tenancy and no one can move you. And Martha took it with hands that trembled just enough for Daniel to notice. Later, when most of the officials had gone and the sun was sliding lower, Martha walked over to him where he stood by his truck. "I don't know how to thank you," she said, voice roughened by years of smoke and worry. "You don't have to," he replied. "Just live in it. Fill it up. That's thanks enough." She studied his face for a long moment, then nodded once, as if sealing something unspoken, and went back to shoo Lucas away from trying to climb the porch railing. The day the community center opened, they didn't have a ribbon cutting so much as a potluck. Pickup trucks and sedans lined the newly graveled lot, and older folks from town arrived in their Sunday clothes even though it wasn't Sunday, carrying covered dishes and folding lawn chairs just in case. Inside, the building smelled of fresh paint and coffee and the assortment of casseroles that could only happen when 3 generations brought their best recipes. Someone had set up a table in one corner with old photographs, black and white images of the town main street, a young Henry Ellison standing in front of a much younger barn, wedding pictures, and Little League teams. Daniel found himself in one or two of the newer ones, younger and in uniform, face still rounder, eyes less lined. He looked at those photos longer than he meant to. In the background of nearly every scene that day, Shadow moved from cluster to cluster, pausing for the occasional, careful pat from gnarled hands, then returning to Daniel's side, as if tethered by something stronger than a leash. When the speeches wound down and the sun started to lower, casting a golden wash across the porch, someone turned on a radio to an oldies station. The music drifted out under the eaves, soft and familiar. Daniel stepped out onto the porch to get a breath of cooler air and found one of the chairs near the edge empty. He settled into it slowly, joints making quiet objections that the chair's smooth wood absorbed without comment. He shrugged out of his buffalo plaid jacket and hung it over the backrest, the red and black checks bright against the pale wood, and rolled up his sleeves. The air was soft, the sky streaked with the last hints of pink. A few minutes later, the screen door creaked and Evelyn appeared, carrying two mismatched ceramic mugs that steamed in the cooling air. She had changed out of her courthouse blazer into a simple cardigan, her silver bob catching the light, the lines at the corners of her eyes deepening when she smiled. "Thought you might need this," she said, handing him one of the mugs. "Committee meetings are dangerous. People might start asking you to chair things." "Don't threaten me," he replied, but there was a warmth in it. He wrapped his fingers around the mug, savoring the heat. The first sip was strong and a little too hot, exactly the way he liked it. Martha followed a few minutes later, pushing the door open with her hip, both hands occupied by a tray of cookies that smelled of cinnamon and butter. She'd put on a fresh blouse for the occasion, a pale blue that made her eyes look younger. "If they're going to make a place for old folks, we might as well sweeten the deal," she announced, setting the tray on a low table between the chairs. Lucas hovered in the doorway, torn between running back to the group of kids playing in the yard and staying within range of the cookies. Daniel reached out with one booted foot and nudged the tray a fraction closer to him. "I think there's enough for one more," he said. Shadow, having followed Martha faithfully, circled once and then flopped down at Daniel's feet, the big dog's body a warm line across the porch boards. He rested his head on Daniel's familiar brown boots as if they were the only pillow he'd ever need, eyes drifting half shut, ears still twitching at the sounds of laughter and clinking dishes and distant music. The weight of that head on his boots, the steady rhythm of Shadow's breathing, brought a feeling that surprised Daniel in its gentleness. For years, he had measured himself against the night he'd failed to reach a burning house in time, a night in another place that still visited him in dreams. That night had carved a groove in his mind he'd nearly worn himself out walking over and over, always ending at the same door he couldn't get through. But here, on this porch, with the sound of Martha chuckling softly as Evelyn teased her about her recipe, with Lucas's voice mingling with the other children's, with the old folks inside the hall arguing cheerfully about whether the coffee was too weak or just right, the groove felt, if not erased, then filled in a little. Shadow exhaled, a long, contented sigh, and Daniel let his hand drift down to scratch behind the dog's ear. "You did good, partner," he murmured, just loud enough for the dog and maybe the fading day to hear. Evelyn glanced over at him, her expression softening, but she didn't interrupt. Instead, she sat back, cradling her own mug, watching the sun slide lower over the land that had caused so much fear and was now hosting church potlucks and bingo sign-up sheets. Martha broke a cookie in half and set a piece on a napkin by Daniel's elbow, the gesture wordless and understood. Somewhere behind them, on the far side of the property, the first survey stakes for future controlled mining work stuck up out of the ground like careful promises. If the machines came, they would come under watchful eyes this time, with paperwork that matched reality and a town that knew exactly what was happening under its feet. Daniel didn't fool himself into thinking corruption had vanished or that greed couldn't find new cracks to seep through. The world didn't change that cleanly, but this patch of it, This farm that wasn't called Ellison's or Reeves's anymore, so much as simply the land by the center, had been pulled back from the worst of it. As the evening deepened and the first stars pricked through, conversation on the porch ebbed into a comfortable quiet. The radio inside played a slow tune he recognized from years ago, a song about second chances and going home. Daniel leaned back in his chair, feeling the solid wood under his shoulders, the soft press of Shadow's head against his boots, the presence of friends at his side. At nearly 60, with more road behind him than ahead, he understood, suddenly and clearly, that some pieces of earth could be bought and sold on paper, parceled out in acres and assessed in dollars. But others, like the one under this porch and the years he had left to sit on it, were held by different currency altogether. Courage had brought him here, and compassion for strangers, for a widow and her grandson, even for the younger man he used to be, had let him stay. The rest, he thought, as laughter drifted out into the soft Midwestern dusk, was just paperwork. Sometimes what looks like a curse is only a miracle waiting for the right heart to uncover it. Daniel thought he was walking into another failure, another broken place he couldn't save. But God had other plans. Through danger, fire, and fear, He revealed not only the truth buried in that land, but the truth living inside one tired old soldier's heart, that it is never too late to stand up for what is right. In our own lives, we may feel worn down, forgotten, or afraid to get involved one more time. Yet again and again, God shows us that courage is not the fire of youth. It is the quiet strength to do what is right when walking away would be easier. Miracles don't always come as sudden wonders. Sometimes they come as second chances, loyal companions, and the choice to protect one another. If this story touched your heart, please take a moment to share it with someone who might need hope today. Leave a comment to tell us what this story meant to you, and subscribe to our channel so we can keep bringing you stories of faith, courage, and quiet miracles. And may God bless you and your loved ones. May He watch over your home, your health, and your heart. And may His peace walk with you through every ordinary and extraordinary day ahead. Amen.